Good afternoon. Welcome to the Center for Global Development. My name is Liliana Rojas Suarez, Director of the Latin American Initiative here at the Center and a Senior Fellow. And it's an honor and a real pleasure to host today this event with ministers from Latin America. Before starting, I have to say a big thank you to Máximo Torero, right here. Our greatest gratitude. He's the Executive Director for Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Paraguay, Peru, and Uruguay from the World Bank, and your co-host for this event. Without him, our ministers wouldn't be here. So thank you so much, Máximo. Today, our conversation with the ministers is very timely. Reports from the multilateral organizations and the Wall Street reports, all of them, including the IMF, basically forecast a very lackluster growth, economic growth for Latin America. Of course, there is huge difference between countries, and you're going to see that during our conversation. But the IMF, for example, does not forecast a convergence, a significant convergence in income per capita towards advanced economies in the next coming years. At the same time, there is a number of countries that are in need of fiscal consolidation, which, as you know, could be procyclical, at least in the short run. So what is the role of fiscal policies and fiscal reforms in reigniting growth in Latin America? To discuss this and other subjects, we have with us, starting from my far right, Mauricio Cárdenas, Minister of Finance and Public Credit from Colombia, Luis Andrés Caputo, Minister of Finance from Argentina. I have them in the wrong order because Lea is supposed to be here, but it's not. All right. Lea Jiménez, Minister of Finance from Paraguay. José Antonio González Anaya, Secretary of Finance and Public Credit of Mexico. And Felipe Larraín, Minister of Finance of Chile. We were also supposed to have Minister of Finance from Peru, but he didn't come to Washington. He didn't default on CGD. He defaulted on Washington, so just to make it clear. So I'm going to be taking questions from the audience later on, but in the meantime, please feel free to live tweet using hashtag CGD Talks. All right, so let's start. Based on macroeconomic indicators, overall resilience of Latin American countries, basically resilience to economic growth and financial stability to external shocks, has deteriorated in recent years. Public debt ratios have either increased or remains very high, and some countries have important external borrowing requirements as reflected in the current account. This is happening when there is uncertainty about the pace of increase in interest rates in the United States, and when protectionist threat with the danger of an escalated trade war between major economies are deepening global uncertainties and increasing volatility in international capital markets. Given the proven sensitivity of Latin America countries to external global factors, can a perfect storm be in the making? I'd like to discuss with the ministers what is the appropriate fiscal response under current circumstances. Are the ministers considering these increased turbulences as temporary, in which case letting the fiscal accounts deteriorate is the right policy response? Or are they considering it as permanent, in which case they would have to adjust the fiscal situation? Of course, it's very hard to separate temporary from permanent factors, but still, policies have to be made and decisions need to be taken. So, could I please have a very precise response, first from Minister Cárdenas, Caputo, and Jiménez? I have extra questions for Minister González Anaya and Larraín.
Extra points.
Shall I begin?
Why the
Please.
difference? Huh? I don't know. I'm going to take this personal.
So, well, first of all, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
especially at the CDD, and thank you, Liliana and Maximo, for hosting this. So your question kind of implies that there's a storm coming and that we should be prepared and that we should think about what type of fiscal policy to adopt. And I see the things slightly differently. I see that we had a storm. We had a really serious storm. In one way or another, we all had to deal with a shock to our terms of trade. In our case, in Colombia, it was a significant shock. We lost 50% of our exports. That's not a small figure. Some historians have looked at this and have concluded that it's one of the severest shocks in our Republican history, only comparable to the Great Depression in the 1930s and the civil war that we had in Colombia at the turn of the 19th century, called the 1,000 Days Civil War. So we had to deal with that. But that was in 2014, 2015, 2016, and we had to adjust to that. And we have adjusted, and we're now in a recovery. So we're getting out of that type of scenario. And the outlook for us looks much brighter. That's how we see it. With a global economy that is recovering, it's growing faster. Yes, there is the uncertainty associated with the increasing interest rates in the developed world, especially here in the US. But provided strong macro fundamentals like we have, low and sustainable current account deficit, which is about 3% of GDP. Our fiscal deficit is also 3% of GDP. Inflation is about 3%. Provided that we have that, we should be able to absorb the increasing interest rates in the US without major disturbances. So we're not seeing us getting into a storm, but coming out of it well and alive with an economy that's recovering. That would be my short answer.
That's a good one. Minister Caputo.
In our case, I would say that we still depend more on ourselves than what happens in the world. I mean, we still have our rates 250 basis points above most of my peers here, and fully agree with what Mauricio said. We are trying just to make our economy go for in a normal track. That is to have a macroeconomic balance budget, lower inflation, clear rules, and an intelligent integration with the world. Those are the main themes that we are looking for. So I would say that as long as we comply with our fiscal targets and as long as we comply with our policies, we can neutralize by lowering our country risk any effect of any increase on interest rates. Of course, as long as those hikes in interest rates are, coming in an orderly fashion. If we have events such as the ones we had in 2008 or 9, well, yeah, definitely that will have an impact, not just in Argentina, but probably everywhere. So in that event, we will probably have to fasten our seatbelts a little bit more and do our homework. But from what we are witnessing now, we feel comfortable that the path that we have chosen is a correct one and that we will easily cope with this environment, this new environment.
Thank you. Mr.
Thank
Jimenez?
you. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. It's an honor to be in this panel. From the point of view of Paraguay, I feel a little bit similar to Mauricio. I think that the worst has passed. I don't foresee a storm, at least in the case of Paraguay, in the case of the region. I think the future is brighter now. We start to see the sun coming out. And specifically in Paraguay, just like most of the region, we face the significant decline in the commodity prices, and this, of course, impacted us significantly. We remain primarily an agricultural economy, and therefore this is likely to impact us very significantly, not only from the micro, but also from the macro, but also from the micro point of view. Nevertheless, we were lucky. And we were lucky that we have been doing and making the right decisions over the last 15 years. We have enjoyed 10 years of macro stability that made us very strong, and we were able to build on that. When the commodity prices strike, we felt the shock, and I think it was not only that shock that we felt, we also have an internal shock, a man-made shock that came from the Congress. The Congress have just approved in 2012 a significant increase in wages, which meant about $400 million increase, a permanent increase, which was huge. And of course, that made us rethink, okay, we have a reduction in revenues, we have a huge increase in wages. What do we do now? What do we do now in a country that needs to continue growing, that needs to continue pushing for infrastructure, that needs to increase in the safety nets for the population? We still have 28.5% of people living in poverty. And therefore, we really have to rethink what we were doing. And from that point on, thinking about our strengths, and our weaknesses, we were able to identify areas where we could actually transform into opportunities. Specifically infrastructure, we started looking into new ways to finance infrastructure. We started going into the PPP laws, we started going into the key in hand laws, partnering with the private sector to put forward large infrastructure projects which were never done before in Paraguay. This completely changed that, generated jobs, revitalized the economy, and this is how we were able to attain a 6% average growth over the last 5 years in the midst of a regional, I would say, crisis. Brazil was facing one of the worst crises in his history. So that was one thing, one important thing. But we also passed the fiscal responsibility law, and we also passed the transparency law. And I believe that we always talk about fiscal responsibility law, we love it, it puts restraints, and we cannot grow wages that much, we cannot grow the deficit, everything is in check. But this policy would have never worked as well as it did if we did not have the transparency law. Why so? Even as we have a decline in revenues, we were able to double the size of social programs because we were able to restructure our budget significantly. And therefore, this is when we see that, okay, we suffer a significant shock, but we were lucky that the macro fundamentals were strong, and this allowed us to rethink, restructure, adapt, and do things differently.
Thank you. Minister González Anaya, among Latin American countries, Mexico has been the most impacted by protectionist threats.
I'm sorry?
Protectionist threats and uncertainty about NAFTA. And investment has been affected, as you know. This certainly complicates the role of fiscal policy. What is your view?
Well, we also suffered the shocks that everybody else suffered, and our response was to, in the last few years, to embark on a fiscal consolidation plan. And just to compare the shocks, the price of oil fell by a half, and the oil platform in Mexico continued to fall. If you do just a comparative of the oil shocks in the last 30 years, this would have meant surely a recession for Mexico, and it didn't. Mexico has grown a record number of quarters in the last few years, not as high as we would want, but it has grown. Now, what we are facing, so now you know why we're special. You don't have that problem. That's why they added something to the question.
Exactly.
And there's another one, which we're facing election in a few months.
I know, that's the next question. Just focus on NAFTA now.
But you have a shock in the north.
So our fiscal response to this is to continue on the fiscal consolidation path. We ran a primary surplus last year. We're running a primary surplus this year. The administration ends this year, and we're going to propose to the new administration, whatever it is, to run a primary surplus. The levels of debt in Mexico are relatively low and compared internationally. But more importantly, they're falling as a share of GDP. So that's what we are going to continue to do. Our stabilization funds, which are incipient and new, are still at record levels. They're over 1% of GDP. So we're playing the conservative card fiscally. And for us, NAFTA is very important. It has served the country well. It has turned Mexico in the last 20 years to something that I don't think many people predicted. As economists, we always like to say how much things affect. And I have done some research, and Mexico in 1990 exported $40 billion. The most optimistic prediction of what NAFTA was going to do to Mexico was that Mexico was going to export $50 billion. Mexico exports $400 billion. So clearly, NAFTA has transformed the country, and that's why the Minister of Commerce is here today. The Minister of Foreign Affairs is here today. I'm here today. This is important for us.
Thank you. Mr. Larraín, in contrast to several other countries, Chile's public debt is very low and has remained very low. But external debt as a ratio of GDP has been increasing significantly. And that has been mostly because of private debt, not public debt. Is this a concern for your government based on the experience from so many other countries, that private debt in a bad situation actually become contingent liability for the government, even if the private debt is taken by exporters?
Well, thank you, and pleasure to be here at the center with my colleagues. Well, first of all, we don't take lightly what happened with public debt, because even if we have a relatively low level of public debt, the public debt to GDP is about 24%, but it doubled over the last 4 years. So it went from $35 billion to $70 billion. And that is certainly a cause of concern. We cannot keep a pace of doubling public debt every 4 years. So when we got into government, we said we have a plan of fiscal consolidation. Fortunately, to some extent, but also due to things that are happening inside Chile, the economy is turning around. How so? Last year, Chile grew by only 1.5%. This year, the forecast is 3.5%, and I'm happy that the IMF got attuned to the new realities and just increased the forecast the day before yesterday. But we had increased it, sometime before to 3.4. The IMF says now 3.4. We have said 3.5. So this is more than doubling the rate of growth of last year. There are a number of issues here involved. One is that we have better external conditions. But as Luis Caputo said, my colleague from Argentina, most of the job has to be done internally. We cannot just think that we are, just dependent on whatever happens in international markets. It is true that with a better situation in international markets, we're better able to grow. We have tailwinds is better than having headwinds, sure. But then some periods in Chile, we grow half of the world, and other periods we grow 40% more than the world. So how do we deal depends a lot on the internal role and the internal job that we do. We have also to say, and not just because I'm a minister of the new government, that expectations have, if you look at any surveys of expectations in Chile, the polls have improved significantly after the second round, after President Piñera was elected. All the polls of business sentiment, consumer confidence jumped. It was not a smooth increase, it was a jump. So we're seeing investment recover. We had 4 years of decline of investment in a row. This is the worst performance of Chile, longest streak of investment decline in a century without external shock. You don't find any other period in the last century of 4 years of investment decline, 4 years of productivity decline. So we're coming with a program that we say we have to, it's not going to be easy. Our growth projection for this 4 year period is 3.5 to 4. This is more than doubling the rate of growth from where we're coming. And it's not going to be easy. On the fiscal front, we believe it's better. We just, a couple of weeks ago, only 15 days after we came to power, we established a new austerity instructive. We're saving $500 million on travel, cars. I have some of my colleagues saying to me, but Minister, my car has 200,000 kilometers, already, and said you have to go for another 100,000, because you can renew a car when after 8 years. So we're doing this because we want to send a signal and because we want to significantly reduce the level of fiscal deficit. Last year was 2.8% of GDP. We want to, have at least 1 percentage point decline for this year. We want to go to structural balance in 4 years. And although you're right that our public debt is low at 24%, well, somehow two of the risk rating agencies, two of the most important risk rating agencies, Standard & Poor's and Fitch last year, downgraded Chile for the first time in a quarter of a century. So we want to recover that and recover the lost notch in the risk ratings. And for that, we will have a fiscal consolidation in our country. And we believe that we can do it also because the economy is picking up. So we're not going to be pulling the fiscal brake at times when the economy is slowing down, but at times when the economy is improving. So yes, we're not so concerned about the level of private debt. We don't believe it is at worrisome level. It has increased. And our immediate effort is going to be concentrated on public debt, the fiscal deficit, and on getting Chile back on track to solid growth again.
Okay, thank you. Represented in the panel are 3 countries where presidential elections are taking place very soon. Colombia, Mexico, and Paraguay. Actually, Paraguay this weekend. Often in Latin America, in the past, election cycles are not good times for fiscal discipline. We know our history very well. But I just listened to the ministers, and they are all talking about fiscal discipline, doing the right thing at the right time. So the question is, what is different now? Has Latin America matured, learned its lessons? Now we have governments that actually can leave good fiscal accounts for the next government. Can I please have a short answer, but the views from Ministers Cárdenas, Jiménez, and González Anaya?
Should I start again?
I asked you.
So President Santos, you know him very well, was a finance minister 18 years ago. And he had to deal with a very severe crisis. It was the financial crisis of the late 90s. It was, I guess, the hardest time in our economic history. We had, for the first time since we record statistics, a decline in our GDP. And at that time, one of the measures he adopted was a reduction in government salaries, which was overruled by the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court then said that that was unconstitutional, that salaries of the public sector had to increase at least by the inflation rate. Years later, he becomes president, and one of the first things he said and he did was to introduce in our Constitution the concept of fiscal sustainability. Because the Constitution is full of rights, some of them in conflict with each other, but no one is defending in the courts the concept of fiscal sustainability. So he said that that was very important to ensure that these measures are embodied into our Constitution. So with this was the umbrella for then introducing a fiscal rule, which is legal, part of a law. So we have a clear mandate in terms of the maximum fiscal deficit with the aim of having a 1% structural fiscal deficit. So that's a constraint that future governments will have to deal with, in the sense that fiscal sustainability is something that is the Constitution, is the law. Think, for example, of the other building blocks of our macro framework, inflation targeting, independent central bank. That's also part of our Constitution. So it's not so easy to change course. And I think this is an important element of any electoral process, any transition. But more than that, more than the legal or constitutional restrictions, I think ultimately what prevails is that the model that Colombia has adopted has delivered very good results for the population. Our poverty rate was 30% in 2010. Today is 17%. And the decline in poverty was not interrupted by the oil shock. Same with inequality. The Gini coefficient has continued to decline. The formalization of the labor market has to continue to increase. So if you're on the right track, if you're providing the right results, why change the model? I don't think there is a good and compelling reason for that. And the electorate knows that well.
Fair enough. Minister?
Thank you. I think in the case of Paraguay in particular, we can say that we have been maturing over time significantly. But I'm not saying about over the last 5 years. I'm talking about over the last 4 years alone, which I have witnessed myself, the change happening in front of my eyes. Just like Colombia, we have today a fiscal responsibility law. We have the transparency law. And I have to say, in the midst of perhaps the most difficult timing for a Minister of Finance, you have to go through the election period, the political part of the cycle, very political part of the cycle, where the pressures do increase significantly. But today we see a great deal of institutional maturity that is reflected in the fiscal responsibility law and the passing of it, the respecting of it, right? The last budget, yes, we did have the unions coming and asking for wage increases, and I'm not saying 1 or 2. We have all of them. But we were able to, pull them away and say, we have to respect the fiscal responsibility law. As Mauricio said, this is something that we have as a country been digesting over the years. And today, we abide today, we understand it, it has strengthened our institutionality, the fiscal institutionality, but it has also, permeated to society. Today, Paraguayans, even as not all of them might know exactly what the fiscal responsibility law does, they demand that we respect the fiscal responsibility law, every single one. And the same happens, incredibly enough, in Congress. The congressmen are talking about it. So I think we are maturing. I wouldn't say that we are adults yet, but we are overcoming puberty quite well.
Okay.
Yes.
Minister González-Anaya.
Well, I think the Mexican case, I wouldn't answer it as hopefully as Mauricio or Lea have answered it. I don't think there is a broad consensus, and we're facing a very difficult elections in which all of these questions, all of these values are being questioned. But the transition, I think, will be okay. That's my job. And I think the part of the history comes from the fact that Mexico has a long history of sexennial crises, 76, 82, 88, 95, every single one. So since then, we had our first non-crisis transition in 30 years, in 2000, 2006, 2012, and now 2018. So as we've moved towards the end of the administration, people start looking at us more carefully. And we have managed since 2000 to have all of these transitions, economically without any hurdles. And I think these were very traumatic experiences. So that's why we prepared, and I think that's why we have taken the prudent fiscal position in the last couple of years to close the administration. All of these institutions, we have been working on them for some time. We keep, unquote, perfecting or improving our fiscal responsibility law, which has existed for about 10 years. But, as politicians, we're tremendously, whoever happens, tremendously creative at circumventing the fiscal responsibility law. So you always have to switch them so that doesn't happen. I think that's the reason, that we was very traumatic, but there's not the consensus that I hear from my colleagues here that that's the right way to go. So it's a very difficult, trying time.
Okay, thank you.
Say one
Sure,
thing
Felipe, go
about-
ahead.
Just an issue observing from the outside. We're not facing. Luckily, in Chile, we're not facing election. We just came in.
Well, you just won.
You know, we just won.
You do.
It's a different situation. But one overall comment. I see some of my colleagues here, economists, and we have studied and I've done work on the political business cycle, which is what happens, the political business cycle, the opportunistic business cycle, it happens around elections, that you always try to stimulate the economy. I would say, based on all what my colleagues have said here, that one thing is the cycle. The political business cycle has existed and has been documented. But one thing is the cycle without institutions, and when you have fiscal rules, fiscal responsibility laws, autonomous central banks, fiscal councils, which are autonomous, it's much tougher to do and exploit the political business cycle. So I think that what has happened in Latin America is that we are having better institutions, because we cannot just trust that we're going to have people as responsible and and illuminated as my colleagues here at election time, because you can resist the temptation, but some other people. What you have to have is a good way to resist the pressures. The pressures will always be there, and congressmen will always try to. I have never seen a congressman. This is my second time as finance minister, so I'm in the 5th year. So I've worked with them. I never saw a Congress that didn't have a bright idea how to spend money. This is.
May I interrupt you and ask a question? But just in your previous intervention, you said that you inherited a not very good trend of public spending. So how that does go together with those long-term institutions in Chile?
Because we are not in automatic pilot, and it depends a lot. Within the institutions, there are ways in which you can work, and some people want to deepen those institutions, and another ones, find a way within the institutions to circumvent a little bit and to spend more. Otherwise, we just won't have finance ministers. We just have, automatic pilots and put the economy, and we will be out of a job. So
Elections matter.
Yes, they do.
No matter.
Okay.
Can I say something about?
Yes, of course.
So
this seems to be
I
a
think
fair topic.
we are avoiding the word, which is the elephant in the room, which is populism, and the risk of populism. And I think that risk is real. I don't want to undermine that. That risk is real, especially in a region that is growing below potential. And as a result of the shock of the terms of trade, maybe easy answers on how to go back to high growth are appealing, and we should not discard that. However, and just one note on why I'm slightly more optimistic, at least in the case of Colombia. We already had our congressional elections, which were held in March. And the majority in Congress is formed by the same parties that have supported these responsible economic policies, like the fiscal rule, for example. So it will be hard for a populist executive to move forward an agenda that involves reforms to our constitution or reforms to our laws that could actually make our economy behave in a very different way. That's what gives me slightly more optimism.
More optimism. Okay. Great. Let me go back to the issue of economic growth. In most Latin American countries, informality, low productivity, and low ratios of tax revenue collection are seen part of the same equation behind the lackluster behavior of growth in the region. Low tax revenues that result from informality constrain public investment and growth, of course, and cement the dependence on external debt. There has been a number of proposals and some policy actions have been put in place to reduce informality. But progress, depending on the country, of course, has been limited. How can this issue be finally and effectively tackled? Minister Jimenez, can I have your view?
Sure, thank you. I knew you would give me that difficult question. Well, I think it's not a matter of only collecting revenues. When we think about fiscal policy, we have to think about fiscal policy as a whole, not just revenues, not just expenditures. In the case of Paraguay, we are constantly told you have to increase taxes to be able to finance infrastructure. You have to increase taxes to be able to finance, many, many, many necessities that the country has. Nevertheless, at the same time, we have to understand the particularities of this country. We are a country that was managed in complete darkness, to put it in a very extreme way, in the past. People did not know how we spend the money, what we did with the money, why should we contribute more to the government when we don't know what you are doing. And we see you have a nice car and you have, why should I pay more taxes? And this has been, it's really deep in the core of Paraguayan people. So therefore, our immediate task, rather than just simply dreaming about increasing taxes, increasing the fiscal, the tax burden alone, that will not resolve the issue. That might actually generate further informality. And therefore, we have to work into truly proving to people, to the taxpayers, that we are spending the money rightfully, that we're spending the money transparently, and that we're using the resources every time more and more efficiently. Doing just that, opening the black box and starting to see, like I always say, we start to see the fat. You have to start cutting the fat, right? It doesn't look pretty. So you have to start cutting it. And as we did that, this is what allows us, as I said before, to restructure our budgets to start showing people we are thinner and slimmer and more efficient, and we are working on that. We are not quite there yet, so that's something that we have to continue doing. Of course, we have to continue strengthening the capacity of the revenue administration. We have done that in the last four years. We have been going after the tax evaders like never before. We have found these mega evasion cases, we call them. We have so far 8 mega evasion cases. And this, it's not like Paraguay didn't have mega evasion cases before. Mm-hmm. It's just we are finding them now. We are finding them now because we have better technology, because we have also changed the way in which we pay the public workers that are supposed to find those evasions and go after those very powerful people. And therefore, we changing very small administrative changes had a huge impact in terms of our revenues. Internal revenues, by simply improving the capacity of the revenue administration, increased about 60%. It's huge, it's enormous. And we have not increased taxes. We have also improved the way in which we are spending. We have improved the targeting of programs. We have improved, obviously, transparency brings everything out and people can see how we are doing, what we are doing. We have been cutting excess, and therefore, it's a living thing that is evolving, and eventually we will get there. We have been able to find fiscal space by simply doing these things. Huge fiscal space. I'm not talking about small, I'm talking about large numbers that have meant that today we have the higher level of infrastructure investment that we have never had before. And also social programs coverage. It's incredible. Where is all the money coming from? We are spending it better. So we have to keep working on that.
Minister Caputo, I have 2 questions for you because I got distracted and I forgot to ask you another question. So I'll ask 2 questions at the same time, okay? First one, the new administration has chosen a gradual path of adjustment to achieve fiscal consolidation and a reduction in inflation. After 2 years in government, some experts have started to think that it's getting a little bit too slow, that the fiscal deficits that Argentina are displaying are still too high. So my first question is there a plan to reduce fiscal deficit at a faster pace? And the second question is whether the December 2017 tax reform Will it, you think, will have a positive effect on reducing labor market informality, which is greater than 30% at this time, closer to 40 actually?
Okay. Well, you're right. I mean, we inherited a very difficult situation because we inherited a fiscal deficit of more than 5.5 percentage points of primary deficit. But at the same time, we inherited a country totally undercapitalized, with no investment for the last many, many years. Beyond the fact that we were in default, poverty at 30% level. But not only that, taxes had risen more than 10 percentage points of GDP in the last 12 years. So we needed to adjust our fiscal deficit on one side, but we needed to invest more and more in infrastructure because we had a social debt in infrastructure that we had to fill somehow. That's the reason why we chose this gradual approach towards equilibrium, because essentially we had no other choice. Clearly, we couldn't raise taxes. Actually, on the contrary, we had to lower taxes. And when talking about reducing expenditures, we could have gone for a brutal adjustment or choosing this path of gradualism that essentially means that we are reducing our deficit 1 percentage point per year. The reality is that there was no political, no social space to digest such a brutal adjustment that we could have made in 1 or 2 years. So we chose the only thing that we could do, that was this gradual approach. You're right, in the meantime, we had to finance that transition. And that's a reason why we also put the house in order when we finally arranged the problems with the holdouts. We got the possibility of financing ourselves again. We are doing it at the lowest rate in our history now. Our average rate in the different terms last year was 4.15% in dollars, which is almost 1/3 of the average rate at which we were financing ourselves in the 90s and in the early 2000s. So essentially, because we have recovered financing and because we could do it at a very low rates and starting also from a low level of debt, is that we decided to go for this gradual path. That is actually working. If we could go faster, you're right, some people question that, but the reality is that we are doing it. The first year, we overfulfill our fiscal targets. In 2017, that was our second year, we overfulfill our fiscal target too. And this year, we have a target of 3.2 that we will most likely overfulfill it again. So what I'm trying to say is, if we could go faster, we'll do it. And that's what essentially we are doing. And with respect to the tax reform, Diana, and going back also to the question that you asked, Leah, we have done a significant fiscal effort because, as I said, I mean, we are reducing the deficit at the same time that we are lowering taxes and investing more and more in infrastructure. Let me add for a second this part. When we talk about investing in infrastructure, we also had to become more creative, and we had also chosen the path of the PPP now structure. We have now in the pipeline more than 60 projects for around $30 billion in capex deployed over the next 4 years. That will almost double our investment in infrastructure per year in the next 4 years. But back to the question, if the tax reform was working with the labor market, definitely it is working. We are already seeing, even though it's been a very few months, we are already seeing the results of that. Tax collection is actually booming now in Argentina. It's coming significantly better than we were expecting. It's a combination of essentially the economy doing better, but also this this fight with against informality, and it's working great.
Thank you. Mr. González Anaya, 5 years after the tax and labor reforms in Mexico, is it delivering the expected results in terms of reduction of informality, or is it time to another round of reforms?
No, well, I think the results have been tremendous, because Mexico typically had non-oil tax revenue that was very, very low. And with the latest tax reform, tax revenues increased 5 percentage points of GDP, which is a tremendous amount. In fact, I didn't do it. He did it over there. He's not very popular in Mexico, but he's the architect, and he did a wonderful job. And it was almost, it's one of these things where, for once, things played in our part. I am positive that if we had not done the tax reform, when we faced the massive oil shock, we would have had a tremendous fiscal adjustment to make. But since they kind of coincided, we managed to sail through almost neutrally in terms of total size of government. So that has worked well, but it has also meant that we have increased the number of tax contributors in the last 5 years by 50%, from 40 to 60 million. So that's also a very good result. The tax structure was your usual tax structure. It was, it has a VAT and income tax, etc. So it was a matter of changing, closing loopholes and things like this. And then the labor reform has also had, I think, a tremendously unexpected result, which is that the formal employment has increased at twice the rate of GDP growth. Formal employment has increased at over 4% in the last 5 years, and Mexico has grown around 2%, more between 4 and 4.5%, and 2 and 2.5%. So this has meant that more formal jobs have been created in the last 5 years than in the previous 12 years, which is not something, if you had asked me, 5 years ago, I wouldn't have predicted those results. So those have worked out well for us.
Thank you. Minister Larraín, informality in Chile, when we look at it on an overall basis, is not high relative to other countries in the region. But if you look at the lowest quintile, informality is actually quite high, even higher than some other countries like Costa Rica or Uruguay. What are the remaining needed reforms in Chile to deal with that issue?
Well, first, a short comment on the issue of tax reform that you raised previously, which has to do also with informality. Yeah. It will be very, very simple, just do arithmetic and say, okay, I increase tax rates and I increase tax collection. That's a very easy thing, but in some cases it's right, in other cases it's plain wrong, because there's no better revenue collector than growth. Mm-hmm. We have calculated in Chile, for every percentage point of additional growth, we get $600 million of additional revenue. So in a 4-year period, one economy growing consistently 1 percentage point above another, or a path which is 1 percentage point above, gives about $6 billion additional revenue. So if you get 2 percentage points, it's over $12 billion additional revenue. I say this because some people get in love with very high tax rates, and I don't think we have to distinguish ourselves, not to have a very low tax rate, but also not to have high tax rates. We have to have a tax rate, and we have to be aware internationally of what we call the fiscal competition. Fiscal competition that European countries know well. You're trying to attract capital.
You're talking the corporate tax.
Corporate tax, yes. And that's fiscal competition is mainly in the corporate tax. And then you have a lot of people saying, okay, no, you cannot give to the, to big enterprises, they have to have a lot of taxes, and then you discover that capital flows, and flows out of your country, and even your own capital, the capital from your residents, can be invested anyway. And that's the issue of capital mobility. So I think many times you try to do one thing, and I'm saying this because of the tax reform that was passed in Chile in 2014, which not only increased tax rates significantly, but also made for a much more complex tax system. Now we're trying to reduce the complexity of the tax system. We're trying to have a moderate reduction of the corporate tax rates from 27 to 25% to integrate the system, but the main thrust is to significantly simplify. And I say this because it has a lot to do with your question of informality. The more complex you do your tax system, the more complex you do regulations to establish as a corporation, the higher is taxation, the more complex is taxation, and the other rules, to live in the formal economy, you're going to have people go out of that, go out of the formal economy into informality. We have seen over the last 4 years in Chile that not only job creation decreased to half. We were creating 1 million jobs, and then we went to create 500,000 jobs in 4 years. But this has gone together with a big increase in informal employment. Self-employment, street vendors. It's a very decent job to be a street vendor, except that it's very vulnerable. You lack social security, you lack a contract, you lack unemployment insurance, you don't contribute to your pension plan. And that's what happens. So you get low growth, normally goes with a lot of, an increase in informal jobs. When you have the economy pick up, it's not only that you're creating more jobs, you're also creating better quality jobs, and you're creating salaried employment and salaried jobs. So I think we have to be, the point you make, we cannot be satisfied, Liliana, because in Chile we have lower informality rates. We have to keep reducing informality, bring people into the formal economy, create jobs that are formal jobs, that are good quality, high quality, that contribute, and at the same time give protection to those workers.
Thank you, Felipe. Minister Cárdenas, what is, in your view, the ideal combination of a tax and labor reform pro-formality and pro-growth? So tax and labor reform together.
Well, I'm happy to pursue on this issue of the formalization of the labor force, because I think this is the crucial issue for the region as a whole. If there is one characteristic of Latin America is high informality, but it's also high payroll taxes. And the reason is that 50 years ago, when our modern tax systems were created, most of the design of those tax systems looked for easy tax bases to use. And the payroll is a relatively easy tax base, as was 100 years ago customs. So, but that was very damaging. There are many studies that are analyzing this issue, and high payroll taxes resulted in very informal labor markets. For example, in Colombia, not too long ago, in 2010, almost 60% of the jobs in the main cities, not in the country as a whole, in the main cities, were informal. For the first time in our history, since last year, we have more formal than informal jobs in Colombia. More formal than informal. And this is the result of the reform that we adopted in 2012 that cut the payroll taxes from about 30% to 16%. So we dismantled the payroll taxes. Of course, in many of our countries, the payroll taxes are earmarked, and the earmarks are very appealing because it's for providing housing or labor training or early childhood attention. They all have very important and relevant earmarks. So we have to think, well, we're not going to fight against all those unions and all the beneficiaries of these programs. We have to figure out a way of transforming those earmarks. So we cut the payroll taxes and we substituted that for corporate income taxes. So we tax capital, we don't tax labor. And that has paid off very well, very nicely in terms of the formalization of the labor market. But that brings us to the issue of the optimal tax on capital.
Yeah.
And the optimal tax on capital is a moving target because it depends on what the others are doing. That's where the tax competition issue comes into place. With the recent tax reform here in the United States, that optimal tax on capital has moved low, has moved below what we used to think. In our case, in Colombia, is a 33% tax rate. Most of the political campaign here in Colombia today is about cutting those taxes. And what I say is, yes, it's desirable to cut corporate taxes. It is absolutely, it has positive effects on investment. But the consequences of that is what we have to analyze. What else to tax? So, what did we do in Colombia? We raised the VAT from 16% to 19%. And that helped us cut a little bit the corporate income tax. That helped us dismantle a very distortionary tax, which was the wealth tax. So we got rid of that. But cutting the corporate tax rate from 33% to something lower, it's going to be a major challenge for the fiscal balance and for the fiscal accounts. I wish, and I admire a lot the point that Secretary Gonzalez made about increasing the tax base, the number of taxpayers, especially individual taxpayers. That's amazing. It's just amazing.
It's amazing.
It's not an easy result, and politically it's very challenging to do that. That's one way to go. We still have too few taxpayers in our countries, and widening the tax base in the case of the personal income tax, I think in your concept of what is the optimal tax reform, that's something that should take place.
And if I may add also, I think in countries like ours, at least in some of them, financing plays a key role, because clearly the best way to fight informality is to simplify your tax regime and to lower taxes, right? For sure, that is something that in the long run will work. The problem that some of the countries face is that in the meantime, you have to finance that, because the immediate outcome of that is that you collect less and you increase your fiscal deficit. So first of all, you need to do that when you're coming from a healthier fiscal situation. And two, once you have no financing issues. I mean, it's easier clearly for the US to lower tax, because we clearly know they can afford to have a fiscal deficit of 5 percentage points of GDP for the next 5 years. Well, I mean, England did the same thing in the last decade, and it worked perfect for them too. We do not have that type of advantage in some of our countries, and that's why it takes longer.
Yeah. Okay, I know that the public is dying to ask you questions, but I would like to have 1 minute answers from all of you, and I mean 1 minute answers. So, in a sentence to Ministers González Anaya, Jiménez, and Cárdenas, in that order, what do you think has been your most important achievement during your tenure as finance ministers, as you are leaving? And to Minister Caputo and Larraín, also in a minute, what do you expect your most important achievement to be? So let me start, Minister González Anaya.
Well, it's a blink response. So to leave the fiscal accounts and the macroeconomic framework in order, so that our successors, whoever they may be, can come in, sit, find the bathroom, read through the papers, and make sure that they can make the right decisions, and they don't, they're not sitting on a hot plate, so that we can have a smooth transition, and we can add one more smooth transition to the Mexican history books.
Thank you.
That's a difficult question.
But you can answer.
Yes. Well, in terms of achievements, I think when I leave, I don't think I have accomplished that yet, because when I leave, I want to leave a very ordered fiscal accounts, right? I don't want the country to face what we faced before when the entering government found empty vaults, right? But I think something that I feel very proud about is the fact that as a Minister of Finance, I became very involved in the education area, right? And I have worked side by side with the Education Ministry in order to think about a reform that is crucial for the country going forward, which is an education reform that looks into the quality of education. This is something that we set up, this is something that is running, and this is something that we want to leave as a legacy for the next government. What is the link of that with the Ministry of Finance? It's an important link. As a country that is developing, human capital is crucial, and it will continue to be crucial for us in the future, and realizing that is key for us. And we have to find a way to finance that, and therefore, Hacienda has to be there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mauricio.
So before I came to this conversation today, I was going to say, well, navigating the storm and coming out of the storm in good shape. But since you first asked that we're going to enter a new storm, I'm hesitant about that answer because you never know.
Exactly.
So I've changed my answer, and my answer is this. I was actually living here in Washington until I became minister. And when I was working here, what people used to say is, yes, Latin America has had a great decade, the reduction in poverty, the increase in the middle class. But that's all the result of high commodity prices that has generated fiscal space, and then governments are just channeling those revenues to the population through subsidies, and that's what has kept the middle class, that has made the middle class to expand. So I think the main achievement is to be able to show that despite the decline in oil prices, all those advancements in the social indicators have not been reversed. And on the contrary, that you have been, and we have been able to continue making progress in all those areas and all those fronts. I think that's the main outcome.
Luis, your expected achievement.
What I would love to see, actually, what I'd really like to see is a continuation of what we started. That is, we have recovered the credit for the country, but our major goal is that that credit flows to everybody. In Argentina, there were times where the country had credit at reasonable levels, provinces maybe too, but then there was a huge gap between them and companies, SMEs, and particularly people. Our major objective is to make credit available for everybody, SMEs, people at reasonable rates and in reasonable terms. That is something that we have to do if we want to have continuous and inclusive growth. SMEs account for 70% of the labor force, and some of them have to finance themselves on a monthly basis at 5, 6, 8% per month. So how thinking about growing when you have to face such a hard burden in financing? So being able to expand the credit for everybody and make it socially, possible for everybody, that would be great.
Felipe, your ambition from a very ambitious man.
You think I'm ambitious? Well, I think that first on the growth front, and I think that's a very essential part, that we are able to get Chile back on a solid growth path. What does it mean? To at least double the rate of growth over the last 4 years.
It's ambitious.
Yeah, I
Double
think it's
from the 3.5?
Yeah.
no. From the 1.7.
That was ambitious.
From the 1.7. The last 4 years. So that just to be clear, because we're going to do with that. We're going to have more revenue. We're going to be able to do a lot of things in the social area, and we're going to be able to significantly reduce our poverty rate. Our poverty rate, depending on what indicator you get, is between 7 and 12% of the population, but we still have, maybe between 2 and 3 million Chileans living below poverty. And I think we have a duty to them. So I think that is one. The other thing is also get Chile's public finances back on track. And that means that, and I will set the goal right now, and you can tell me in 4 years if we did it or not, if I remain for years, because I can be fired anytime. Just this happens to finance ministers. That we get back our credit rating, we get back the notch we lost. So we recover, and this is not because we want to have some kind of record in the international seminars to look good. This is because Chilean public sector, public and private enterprises, and the Chilean people will be able to get resources on better terms. And if we are able to do that, I'll be a happy man.
Yes, good. Okay, questions for the public. I'm going to take several questions at a time to have an opportunity. So there is a mic or somebody's, Angel? No, just, there's a mic coming to you. Introduce yourself, Angel.
Okay, this is Angel Melguizo from the OECD. It's going back a bit to the point that Mauricio Cárdenas said on populism, because we see that in Latin America the political cycles affect or affected fiscal policy, at least until the elections of 2005. In 2010s, it seemed that the region graduated, no? But now we are living a different electoral phase with fake news, with big data, with populism. And in Latin America today, 3 in 4 citizens don't trust the government. And only 4 in 10 are satisfied with public services, and more than half of the citizens justify evading taxes. This is the reality today, and this is the electoral we are living. So the message of institutions and consolidation, maybe markets are getting it. But do you really think that citizens are getting it? I mean, or are they asking for a little bit more on taxes? From the OECD, we would say that in 3 of the 5 countries, a little higher taxes would be good. Thanks.
Okay. Another question? Oh, Teresa?
I'm Teresa Terminacian, formerly from the IMF. The question that I have is somewhat technical, but not that much, because we were talking about the informality and the sort of sources of informality. We are all conscious of the very deleterious effect of informality on productivity and so on. My question is, are the special tax regimes for small enterprises, which are very prevalent in Latin America, a source of incentive for enterprises to stay small and, not informal, but to stay small? And so not to obtain the benefits of scale, and which would be necessary for improvements in productivity.
Okay, thank you. More questions? No?
There you go.
Oh, sorry. Yes, that way.
Hi, Chris Humphrey, Overseas Development Institute. I was just a bit struck when you asked about the best achievements and the best hopes, how limited they were. It's basically, we didn't have a crisis. We came through the storm without falling back. We didn't lose our social gains. And I'm a bit surprised. Is that enough for Latin American finance ministers now to simply not have a crisis? Or should we be perhaps aspiring for something more?
So not ambitious enough, huh? Somebody else? Yes, right there. That would be the question, the last question before I go back to the
Thank you all. Again, Mr. Gonzalez and I touched a little bit on NAFTA and repercussions. Sorry?
Introduce yourself.
Martin Maldonado, World Bank and Georgetown University. So Mr. Gonzalez and I talked a little bit about NAFTA, how that's been such a boon for Mexico over the last 20 years. And I'm interested in, particularly in the ministers of finance from Colombia, Mexico, and Chile. What's the potential that the Pacific Alliance has, and what are other potential? What's the potential for other sorts of trade integration for, I guess, all of your countries? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So let's start now from this side, and you take the questions that you think are more relevant for you. So, Felipe.
Yes, thank you. I will take the one on Teresa on the special tax regimes for small enterprises. I think it's a fact of life that almost all countries have special, more favorable tax regimes with the idea that companies would grow, and the companies will. So you help them and you expect them to grow, but then of course there is a threshold. And depending on where you put the threshold, in Chile, the threshold to lose the benefits is about, right now, a little over $4 million of annual sales. So, I mean, after $4.5 million, you lose the benefits. And there is, of course, some effect on that, and the effect of that is at least twofold. The one effect is that you don't have incentive to grow too much if you're going to lose the benefit, because a huge jump in the tax when you go over the threshold. And the other is that you may be smart enough to divide yourself. So you create structures to avoid the higher taxation. So I think it's a big challenge, but it's very difficult to do away with the benefits of the small enterprises. And I think what we're thinking is ways to probably smooth it out more than just losing it, from one point to another, to have a scale, so that the effect is not so sharp. On the other, that I think is the potential of the Pacific Alliance, I would say that we are 3 of the 5 finance ministers here are founding members of the Pacific Alliance, and we don't have our colleague from Peru,
I know.
But we are very committed to the Pacific Alliance. We think there's a lot we can do in terms of increasing the integration, not just on trade. On trade, we are already at about 94% of our trade moves freely within the countries. We have some of our countries have free trade agreements among ourselves, and I think it's also about the movement of people. It's also about the financial integration, in which we're doing a lot, and that's a realm which is basically under the finance minister. Most finance ministers have to do with the financial sector. So regulation, for example, I'll tell one thing on the Pacific Alliance, that if you're in good standing, that's something we're moving to. Where you're in good standing to your local regulator, then you're in good standing to all countries, every company. So you can be freely quoted in the different stock markets of the region. So we integrate the stock markets, then deepen. And I would finish by just saying that in terms of our 2 other colleagues that are here from Argentina and Paraguay, that you will be most welcome in the Pacific Alliance if you can sort it with Mercosur.
Please.
Why not?
Ya está.
Ya estamos.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think some of these questions are related, and I sum up. I think we're going to work on the Pacific Alliance. Mexico has a record number of free trade agreements, and we will continue to do that. And it's an interesting part, because as negative as I have been on the outlook of the reforms, Mexico has embraced trade. Trade is not an election topic. I don't know what happened, but it has happened. People have learned to live with it, and they have learned to like it. And if you ask most people in Mexico, they would be pro-NAFTA, I would think, which is a good thing for us. So that has worked out very well. On not being ambitious enough, the question was, what would happen when you leave? I leave in 6 months. And when you have experienced the crises that I have mentioned, it's a pretty big jump. And there's a lot to work on and a lot to do to make sure this doesn't happen. And why it's so important for our countries to avoid crises is you fall back a huge amount. It took from 82 to 94 really for Mexico to recover. It took 10 years to get back from the debt crisis. So I think it may not sound, if you had asked me as Felipe, what are you going to do in the rest of your life? Well, that's a different ambition. But for the next 6 months, I think it's very important. It's very important to have smooth transitions. Those have worked well for Mexico, and it's a lot harder to do than it appears because of everything that has been talked about here. So if we can do that, it would set the ground for other ambitions. He wants to grow at twice the rate. He wants to continue with the policies. But the first thing for us is to make sure that we don't stumble.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Okay, on the SME question, the simplified tax system for SMEs, I think that's a reality for most countries. But nevertheless, in the particular case of Paraguay, I think we are a little bit, as a step behind in that dimension. We want to ensure that they are formalized. We have a very high level of informality in the case of small and medium-sized enterprises. And therefore, for us, the priority today, the immediate priority is to formalize them. So we are not so worried about having too much of a simplified system. In fact, we have to seek simplified systems, even more simplified systems today, but perhaps with a view of the medium to long term, right? Prepare, some sort of trigger that at some point when we are found in that specific stage, we make the necessary changes so that we are not stuck with many small enterprises that we know don't attain enough economies of scale in order to be productive. But with regards to the not ambitious enough, I agree. I 100% agree. And I have to say that I find our answers extremely boring. We all think about very simple things such as crisis, such as things. In the particular case, again, I have to look at Paraguay, and I have to say that year after year, the Minister of Finance have focused on the macro stability. The macro stability, sound fiscal policy, the fiscal deficit, We have done that over the last 15 years. We are so good at it. Our fiscal accounts are in check. The monetary policy is doing well, the economy is fine. We really have to think farther and deeper. And we really have to think about how can the macro permeate to the micro. And we really have to think about what are the real challenges that the country faces. It's not just about macro stability. That doesn't quite do it anymore. We have to think about structural reforms. We have to think about human capital. We have to think about technology, modernizing the state. And I believe ministers of finance play a key role in that dimension. Why? Because we have the money, we manage the resources, and we have to work hand in hand with each of these areas and truly get involved into whatever the specific country decides is the priority at that particular moment. We have to think in long terms. We have to think about improving services, basic services, the provision of basic services, access to high-quality healthcare, access to high-quality education. For the case of Paraguay, I'm sure other countries have other priorities, but we do have to get involved and think about farther away from, we know how to sell bonds, we know how to talk about the economy, we know how to do fiscal policy, we know about structural rules or fiscal responsibility laws, transparency. What about efficiency? What are we doing to improve the efficiency of expenditure? These are the micro areas we have to dive into. Luis.
In our case, very similar to what Lea just said. We are also one step behind on the issue of the SMEs. I almost see that problem, my colleagues in Chile and Mexico, almost as a high-quality problem. So, no, we are not there yet. I mean, we are still fighting informality and trying to do our job with respect to that. With respect to the ambitions, at least in my case, I understood we had to pick one. If I had to go for more, coming from where we are coming, I would probably need an hour and a half more. I mean, my list could go on and on and on, but clearly reducing poverty is the number one goal of our government. Get to fiscal equilibrium, of course, is needed. Have, for the first time, continuous and inclusive growth. That is something that Argentina owes their people. We have had over the last 75 years some periods of growth, but inevitably, every 10 years or less, we almost got into a crisis. And every time we hit a crisis, the social gap widens, right? Because more people fell into the poverty line, and the ones who have better resources, they take advantage of the opportunities that arise when crises arise. So the social gap widens, poverty gets higher. So we need now a period of continuous and inclusive growth for the next 20 years. I couldn't go on and on. Enhance productivity, comply with the infrastructure plan that is the most ambitious plan in history that Argentina has. So again, the list is very, very long, but we strongly believe that we are on the right path.
Mauricio.
Well, thank you. All the questions are very good, and I have very little to add to what my colleagues have said. But on Angel's point about the risk of falling into populism because of fake news and the like, yes, I mean, that risk is there. So you are from the OECD. I think it's very important to say that out loud. The region doesn't need populism. It needs even more responsible fiscal policies, increasing fiscal revenues. It's a major goal. We still have very challenging development goals in infrastructure, in social sector, so we need more revenues. And it's very important that the OECD says that. A parenthetical remark, we hope to be the third member country of the OECD from Latin America after Mexico and Chile. We're almost there, very, very close. We hope to leave that legacy. I'm very optimistic about it, by the way. And I know others are coming. Well, on how ambitious should we be? So it's a very good question, yes. Because we're saying, well, Chile is going to grow 3.5%. Peru is growing at about that rate. We're growing, we expect to grow this year 2.7. So yes, I mean, these are not the figures that people would like to hear. So I think two comments are in order here. One is the context. I mean, we could be very easily having a recession after the shocks that we had in the past few years. It's very easy that we could be having a conversation about how to handle the next crisis in a way that we avoid falling back, a reversal. And this did not happen. So that's one aspect. The other aspect has to do with political capital. I think our job is really to exhaust the political capital, use it to the extreme. And that means doing everything you can in terms of, in a crisis like this, raising more revenues, cutting expenditures. We had to face a major depreciation of our currency, which doesn't necessarily make people happy. I mean, we lose value in dollars. But you're as ambitious as you're willing to use that political capital to make sure that you make the right decisions. One way to really exemplify this, I think is the most emblematic case, is the peace process in Colombia. Politically very costly for an administration. Peace process and a peace agreement means making concessions. And some people are not very happy about making concessions to former guerrilla groups. But it's a necessary step to solve a problem that will allow the country to grow faster in the future. That to me is being ambitious, using the political capital to solve problems and then in the future will help societies progress faster. And just one final remark about the Pacific Alliance. Yes, the Pacific Alliance has achieved a lot in a very short period of time. And it's been our responsibility as finance ministers to move beyond free trade. It's not just about free trade. It's about something deeper. And we have a very active agenda on a number of issues that will surprise you. For example, the idea of the passport of funds. If you have a fund to attract investment in one of our countries, you can then market it in the other countries without going and registering it and going through a difficult process. It's an open market. And things are as interesting, but at the same time as opaque as this. We in the Pacific Alliance deal with similar catastrophic risks like earthquakes. So we decided to issue jointly a bond to hedge our countries against earthquakes. And we end up paying a lower premium than it would have been otherwise if we had done it individually. But that just shows the remarkable level of integration to be able to issue a bond like that, to place it, and to basically collect the benefit of our diversification of risk. That's just emblematic of the things we're doing together, which make me very optimistic about the future of the alliance and the implications for our economies.
Well, I want to thank you, all of you, and the ministers to be here at the Centro para el Desarrollo Global. So please join me in thanking all the ministers.
Gracias a ti, Liliana.
No, gracias, estuvo muy bien, muy buena.